evening. We'll call to order the City of Cedar Falls Planning and Zoning Commission Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for Wednesday, January 24th, 2018. Mr. Sturch, if we could have the roll call, please.
Atkins.
Here.
Arson. Here. Geruso.
Here.
Hartley.
Here.
Holst.
Here.
Leeper.
Here.
Oberly.
Here.
Saul.
Here.
She's on the phone. Wingert.
Here.
All right.
Thank you. Move on to the approval of the minutes for the January 10th meeting. And I did have one minor correction to the minutes. We have a reference to Acting Chair Oberly, and that would have been Acting Chair Holst in our item number 1.
Move to approve as noted.
Second.
There's a motion and second. All those in favor of approval for our January 10th meeting minutes signify with aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay.
Aye.
Thank you. Our minutes are approved. At this point, we'll move on to any general public comments. Any comments not here for the specific agenda items? And seeing none, we'll move on to our first business of old business. This is the nominating committee report, and Mr. Arntz, you would present that, please.
Yes, we met briefly last time with, and we, the list came up, and we'd like the nominating committee came up with Ms. Oberly and Mr. Holtz to continue as chair and vice chair, and I'd like to make a motion to the group here to vote on that and move it forward.
Second.
Motion to approve the slate of officers. Is there a second to that?
Second.
And all those in favor of approval of the election of officers for 2018 signify with aye.
Aye.
Those
Aye.
opposed, nay. Okay, thank you. So our officers for 2018 has been approved. Moving on to our next old business item. This is the College Hill Neighborhood Site Plan Review for 2119 College Street. And Mr. Graham, if you would introduce this item, please.
Thank you. This request was before the Commission, if you remember, back in November for original discussion, and then it was back before the Commission again just 2 weeks ago on the 10th for some more discussion. And I'm going to run through some of those changes. What you see tonight really hasn't been changed from the last meeting 2 weeks ago, but there were some changes from the November to the January meeting. So again, I want to kind of go through some of the background on the plan, on the site plan itself. So this slide here just showing the location. It's located along College Street and West 22nd Street. It encompasses 3 different properties that the developer owns. The plan would be to demolish the structures on each of those properties and construct this new building on that property. It is located in the C3 commercial zoning district and is located within the College Hill neighborhood overlay district, and that's why it requires a site plan review from the Commission and approval by City Council. Again, I wanted to go through some of the differences between the original submittal last year that you saw in November and then the submittal back on January 10th and today, showing the original plan showed for the units, it showed 132 total beds over 63 total units. The revised plan that the Commission reviewed 2 weeks ago and today shows a total of 120 beds, so a reduction of 12 beds, however, an increase of 20 units to 83 units. And you'll see that's because there's been an increase in single studio units. The 2-bedroom units stay the same. There was a reduction from 16 to 0 3-bedroom units, and then the 4-bedroom units stayed the same. So one of the major changes was the increase in studio units and decrease in the 3-bedroom units. Again, the original site plan that came in showed a ground floor area, commercial area of 3,060 square feet and 13,699 square feet of residential area. That equates to 18% commercial and 82% residential. The revised plan that came in that the Commission reviewed 2 weeks ago has that revised to show 10,765 square feet or 64% of the ground floor area as commercial, and 5,994 square feet or 36% of the ground floor area dedicated to residential use or non-commercial use. On-site parking, the original plan that was presented last year in November showed 47 on-site stalls, and those were located on the main level underneath a portion of the building. The updated plan does show some main level parking, 18 parking stalls, but this new plan also now shows 47 underground parking stalls for a total of 65 parking stalls. And these images below just kind of show where the parking layout is. The one on the right is the underground, and then the one on the left is kind of the main level parking. Again, going into building design, these are some images as you're looking from College Street. Again, it'll be a 5-story building. The first main level will be commercial with residential on the upper floors. And here's some images kind of looking from the West 22nd Street side. Again, design of the building will be a mix of metal paneling, brick, and mainly glass. Again, depending on what side of the building you're on, there's differences of materials. If you look on the north side, which would be facing to the north, you're at about 50% brick, 35% metal paneling. You look south along West 22nd Street, and the brick is about 36%. Again, you got College Street with 54% brick, 23% paneling, and then looking west, 54% brick and metal paneling as well. You know, a lot of this area doesn't have a lot of metal paneling, so you know that can be something that the commission discusses as far as the design of the building. If the commission wants to discuss that a little bit more, I think when you look at the design of the building, I think a lot of the brickwork is up towards the street fronts along 22nd and College Street, so I think that's why you might see some of those larger percentages of brick along the street-facing sides. This slide is new compared to the last two meetings. So at the meeting 2 weeks ago, we had talked a little bit about building height. And one thing the applicant provided was a height diagram chart, what this shows is the image at the top on the very right is the proposed building showing a height of 63 foot 8 inches. And what they tried to do is show some other differing buildings in the general area and what those heights are. There's 4 different structures. They're showing the St. Stephen Catholic Student Center at a height of 40 feet, Bartlett Hall at a height of 49 feet, the UNI parking garage at a height of 35 feet, and then Dancer Hall at a height of 159 feet. And what I wanted to show on that image below is just kind of where in relation to this project those properties are located. So the little green area is the proposed project location, and then those 4 highlighted parcels in yellow are the buildings are trying to show as far as the height difference there. Again, this image was provided at the meeting last 2 weeks ago. Again, what this shows is mainly just a scale reference showing College Street from 23rd Street to 22nd. You can kind of see the building outlines. And what this image is trying to show is I think the Urban Flats building along West 23rd Street that does sit a little higher, so they're trying to show the scale of the building on the proposed building compared to what some of the building heights are along College Street as that street increases in height a little bit. Again, some of the other things that we look at with site plan reviews that come through, one thing is the height. They are showing a 5-story building, approximately 64 feet. If you look at the immediate surrounding structures, most of them are 1 to 2 story. You do have a couple that are larger than that. But again, from that last image, you can see there are other structures in the immediate neighborhood that do have some differing height that come close or even larger than the height of this building. So wanted to point that out. Other things we look at, building setbacks. Again, this is zone C3, so no setbacks are required. They are showing 5-foot setback along College Street, 2 foot along West 22nd Street, and then 6 foot along the west and north property lines. Again, other things that are reviewed during the site plan review, the trash enclosure. Again, this was discussed 2 weeks ago. They are proposing in a totally enclosed trash enclosure right before you head into the overhead door to get into the parking area. There will be a side door that can get you to the trash enclosure, so this will be a completely contained trash enclosure area. Lighting details, they did provide some lighting details. The image on the left of the square or the rectangular-looking light, those will be in the parking areas, and the lights on the right will be external wall lights that basically just shoot narrow beams straight up and down. And again, there was one comment from our meeting 2 weeks ago about adding some additional landscape plantings along that north parking area. They did provide a new plan showing some of those plantings around that, around those exposed areas of the parking lot. So, again, so when we look at use determination and zoning and what the zoning ordinance requirements are, looking at principal commercial use again, looking at those definitions of principal and accessory use. Again, going back on consistency with past interpretations on that percentage of main use, and again, in your staff report, it calls out 4 or 5 properties. Again, there's a couple on College Street, one on West 23rd, and a couple downtown, where staff has looked at the main floor use to determine the main use of the structure. Again, with this property, this structure, it did show an increase in the original plan from November to now up to 64% commercial on that main level. And then again with parking, so the College Hill Overlake District does state that accessory residential uses on upper floors of commercial uses do not require on-site parking. And it specifically calls that out and says no P&Z review is needed for that. And then again, in our parking section, and in a different section of the ordinance, it does have an exception for upper floor and accessory residential uses not requiring parking as well, where again, that first floor is commercial. So again, we're using past determinations and those sections of the ordinance that talk about having residential on upper floors and then not requiring parking. And so again, just want to reiterate, this site plan does show 65 on-site parking stalls being provided. So from there, it would be staff's recommendation then to recommend approval of the site plan based on meeting the zoning ordinance standards as far as those site plan elements we reviewed. I guess subject to any additional comments or direction by the Planning Commission. Again, in front of you, I handed out a couple letters. There was a couple letters that were submitted within the past day or two. I did email those out to you, but I also wanted to provide them in paper as well in case you haven't had a chance to read them. And then the letters that were submitted last 2 weeks ago or prior to the packet going out, we did get in the packet. So there was a number of letters from various residents and that made it into your packet. So just wanted to make you aware of that as well.
Thank you. At this point, we'd like to invite, if the applicant has any comments or additional information they'd like to present, please come up.
Madam Speaker, members of the Commission, my name is Larry James. I am an attorney. My address is 801 Grand Avenue, Des Moines, Iowa. I'm here on behalf of the applicant, CV Commercial, LLC. Staff laid out the case and really got into the details of the code, why this project meets the code requirements that you folks are tasked with looking at. And I ask that you support the staff recommendation for the very fact that the project does meet the code and what exactly the code calls for. The site plan requirements that we're charged with reviewing tonight have all been met, including the parking requirement. And as you're well aware now, the parking is largely determined by whether the project is a principal permitted commercial use. So how is this determined? And as staff noted, there is a definition of primary use in the code, but the code itself defines primary use as main use. And so there's no definition of what main use is. So we have to look at, again, what the precedent that has already been set by the city is, how the city has treated other properties, other applicants. They've treated other applicants by passing the site plan calling first floor as commercial, including in projects that had 3 and 4 stories, very recently. So I know last time some of the representative of the neighborhood noted there were 2-story buildings, but they failed to mention that some of the projects that have been approved by this commission have been 3 and 4 stories as well. So we're asking to be treated the same. So not only you look at precedent, but you also look at the code. And I'm not going to go through everything that staff has already gone through. But the fact is that throughout the code, residential uses in these type of mixed-use projects, which the city is really trying to encourage in this neighborhood, are treated as secondary accessory uses throughout the code. And for example, in C3, secondary, incidental, or accessory uses include residential units on 2nd or higher floors, and the 1st floor of which is commercial. This describes this project exactly. In the College Hill Overlay District, which this is in the heart of, there too, it describes residential uses on upper floors of mixed-use buildings as secondary uses. Again, this describes this project. The city made a policy decision in the past. The city adopted the College Hill Revitalization Plan, adopted the College Hill Overlay District, adopted C3, which is a very small area of your city, and adopted a master plan that specifically calls for high density on this corner. So it's a unique area in the city. Obviously, this type of development is not going to be appropriate all across the city. But this is a very high-density, walkable, commercial, mixed-use district that the city is trying to encourage. And the developer is simply trying to respond to that, looking at the code, what has been allowed, and asking me to treat it the same way. So in closing, you cannot treat this project differently than others already approved. We're asking that you recognize the precedent the city has set and look at what's allowed in the code. And you may not like the project, you may disagree with aspects of this project, but the fact is the code allows this project to occur without any parking. The applicant has tried to work with staff and try to address some of the concerns of the neighbors and this commission, and has added 65 spaces to the project. So I respectfully request that you approve the site plan and move staff. Thank you very much.
At this point, we'll open up the floor for any public comment. Those who'd like to speak, I invite you up to the microphone. Please state your name and address. Judging from the folks here present, I anticipate we'll maybe have a number of comments. Just ask you to keep your comments concise and try not to repeat others who've spoken before you. So please state your name and address for the record, please.
My name is James Bunkowski, 1706 Cottage Lane in Cedar Falls. I have a few properties on the hill. Generally speaking, they're older homes that have been remodeled into apartments. I have plenty of parking places for all the people that rent for me, and I don't believe that this development would do that at all. And they would then depend upon us taxpayers to buy more parking lots for the residents for this building. I think that if mistakes have been made in the past, they should not be continued for the future.
Madam Chair, members of the Plan and Zoning Commission, my name is Dan Manning, 317 6th Avenue, Des Moines, Iowa, representing the concerned citizens of College Hill. I was before you at your last meeting. We submitted a letter back in November. We submitted a letter on January 10th. We asked that, once again, that prior correspondence be made a part of this hearing as well and be considered as you do your review and make your decisions this evening. we stand in opposition to this project. We certainly do not stand in opposition to development. We don't stand in opposition to redevelopment. But I think you, from our perspective, this application defies logic because of the clear definition of what a principal permitted use is, the clear analysis of your own zoning ordinance. And frankly, you need look no further than the November staff report that you received. As you know, that staff report back in November gave the very same definition. And there was no splitting of hairs of what a main use is, because I think we all understand what a principal, when we're looking at a structure or the land, we're looking at, in this instance, not the first floor, but all of the floors of the property. And what is the main use of that property? What is the permissible use? And your staff hit it on the head. They analyzed that back in November, and they didn't split hairs. They didn't make any reference to the first floor. They said to the applicant that the application that was submitted did not meet the test of that definition that's in your ordinance. When we were here last time, Brian Sires asked the staff, is there another reference, is there any other definition about a principal use other than the one that was submitted back in the November submittal from the staff, or that we had talked about, or that I referenced in my letter dated January 10th of 2018? No. And that's still true today. No one has pointed to any other definition. And so we look at what the main use is, and when you look at the November staff report, you can see that walking through the report that was prepared didn't meet the test on building setbacks, didn't meet the test on density, didn't meet the test on parking, because they were analyzing that 4 out of the 5 stories that we're talking about is a residential use. And that's exactly what now we look at where we stand with the report from January 19th. Now, the only thing that has changed, well, there are 2 things that have changed. The first is that there's more space on the first floor committed to commercial. But we've gone from 63 residential units to 83 residential units. From back in November to January, we've increased that intensity of that residential use. And now when you walk through the present staff report, we talk about, does it meet the density requirements? Well, if you're going to interpret it as this is a commercial use, there are no density requirements. Does it meet the building setbacks? There are no building setback requirements. So and does it meet the parking requirements? There are no parking requirements. Does it meet the green space requirements? There are no green space requirements. Does it meet the landscaping requirements? There aren't any. So what we have is a situation where we have an ordinance, you have an ordinance, C3, that allows residential uses as principal permitted use, and they're good, rational restrictions and limitations that you should look at as a site plan is submitted to you. And those are being ignored based upon this interpretation. And we rely upon the goodwill. When you talk about precedent, think about that. Think about what the precedent would be for a developer who came in, who was acting irresponsibly and said, well, 65% of my first floor is a commercial use, a retail use, whatever it's going to be. And you say, yeah, but we really think you should have some parking requirements, because one of these that we approved recently, they didn't have any obligation to, but they provided. Well, if I don't have any obligation to, I'm not going to provide any. So you can talk about precedent all you want to, but this defies logic. And from our perspective, it's very clear to us, and we hope that as you review this, that you don't have to, I think you bring your common sense into this room and you don't have to rely just exactly on what the staff tells you, even though I know they're good people who have spent a lot of time on this. Go back to what they put in their report in November and see if that wasn't the logical way to handle this, if that wasn't the logical way, because there's no one that I'm representing that says development is bad. There's no one that I'm representing that says that this is something that we want this project stopped. We want it done reasonably, responsibly, and in accordance with a rational, reasonable interpretation of your zoning ordinance. And in that case, it would be a rejection of this application. All that means is the applicant would go back and bring back to you a plan that would be have a lot of density. It would change dramatically the development from what was there to what would be there in the future. It would be glass, it would be nice, I'm confident of that. We are not trying to throw stones at this developer. We're simply saying that it's too much with no responsibility, with no recognition of the obligations that you have in your ordinance that were there for you to protect you and the developers and the property owners in this area. So from our perspective, we would ask that this application be rejected for the reasons stated, both in my previous letters and in our submittal at your last meeting and your submittal this evening. Thank you.
One item I forgot to mention is I believe that this developer owns additional property along 22nd Street, and the taxpayers could get off the hook on providing parking simply if he would require to put parking for his big development on these other places that he owns.
I'm Dr. Brian Sires. I own University Manor, 1939 College Street. I feel a little like I'm in the old Groucho Marx joke where his girlfriend finds him with another woman and he jumps up and says, "Are you going to believe me or your lying eyes?" And what we've got here is a kind of a Trojan horse project where you put a little bit of commercial in there and suddenly you can deceive the city into giving you essentially no regulation. Commercial buildings are not the same as residential buildings. They have different uses. Just like a hummingbird is not really the same as an eagle. A residential and a commercial use require different things. I've let you know through proxies that we checked how many kids around here drive cars, and it's 98%. Everybody who owns property knows that everyone has cars. So these residential ones have to have the parking place. But there are many other things about residential developments that are required. And if you look in the city code, I mean, it's huge. It's like reading the Encyclopedia Britannica. And they have got two tracks. One is a commercial track, one is a residential track, and they're completely different. What's happening in this circumstance here in front of your board is you're starting out with no regulations, and then you're being put in a position of kind of trying to choose what regulations might be appropriate. You're saying, well, we think you should have some parking. The developer says, yeah, I'm going to give you some parking. And then if nobody else raises any arguments, you're left saying, well, that's probably okay. But there are many things that have already been considered by previous people who developed your regulations that know the differences between these. And I'll just give you one example I can think of because it's kind of a ridiculous example. Many people like to have dogs in apartments. I don't think they should have dogs, but they like to have dogs. So they have dogs. So then the dogs have to go to the bathroom once a day or so, and they take them out. If there's no green space, the developer can't put a place for the dogs to, do their natural bathroom duties. So they walk them down the street to my development, and they may or may not pick up. Or I'm told they let them use the bathroom in parking lots and may not pick it up. So I use that example not because I think you should suddenly say, well, we think this guy should have some green space. I think what you should say to yourself is, why is it that we're reinventing the code here for something that the common man would come up and say, well, here's an apartment building sitting right here. If you look at your city code, there's a lot of it, but if you show a sixth grader the relevant areas, in other words, that this building has 4 floors of residential and 1 floor of commercial, that sixth grader is going to tell you that if you slice a candy bar that way, the majority is the part that he's going to choose. He's going to know what the predominant feature of this thing is. This is a residential building. So what I'm asking today is that you recognize what you've really got in front of you, and you say to yourself, why is it that we should totally reinvent the codes on these when it's already written? There are 2 tracks. It's a residential tract. The other decisions are already made, and you won't be in the position of having to suddenly make all kinds of decisions that really aren't yours to make. The city is supposed to follow its own code. This group is supposed to follow its own code. When codes are developed, and we found out last time, or at least I found out, that these are legal restrictions on people. If you write down legal restrictions, you should follow them. I mean, you can say, well, we're going to not have legal restrictions. We're not going to write them down. Or we'll write them down, but sometimes we'll use a rule of thumb instead. Or sometimes we'll use common sense instead. Or sometimes we'll do what we used to do instead. Or sometimes we'll do what we've done in the recent past instead, even though we may have made a mistake. You know, that's not the way laws work. When you have a law, you have to follow it. And the legal obligations in the city code here say that there is a single definition of principal use. The principal use of this building, underneath that definition, is residential. The rest of it is process. The rest of it that's going on here is detail. The fundamental question is this really a commercial building? And the answer is that it's not. Thank you.
Are there other comments?
My name's Kurt Rickard, 223 West 2nd Street, right across the street. I've got a little visual aid. Dave, you hand out, everybody. 2 subjects I'd like to cover. One is a little flustered, sorry. Principal permitted use. I've been looking out on the internet, and there are forums out there, one of which is conducted by city employee kind of people like you see here, and that's who's mainly on that forum. The question was raised out there, can you have multiple principal permitted uses? And the answer that is coming back is, for a single use building, not really, but for a multiple use building, yes, you can have multiple permitted principal uses, especially when you run into buildings where there is commercial, residential, office. You apply the principal permitted use to each section and whatever the requirements are, and you add them together. So the idea that this is just commercial is kind of ludicrous at this point, because what you do is you take each of those, add them together, they each have their own requirements. Get them to fit together, but the requirements are there. It is not like the requirements for the residential, in this example, would be gone entirely. Requirements are still there, okay? Something to think about. Second thing, this that is handed out is a copy of the off-street parking code as it's written. It's only about 3 paragraphs. What I'd like to point out to you is, under the first area, under Section A, is that it requires in all districts that parking be provided on the same lot or property. That's what that first A essentially says. There are two exceptions to this. One is for a principal permitted use in a C3 commercial district. That's the commercial side. As a principal permitted use. And the second one is for as the secondary or residential upper level area. Doesn't have to follow that first sentence. All that really means is there is still a parking requirement. It just does not have to be satisfied on the same lot. If you read the next paragraph, it refers to off-premise parking. I kind of look at that as you can have parking off the premise without having to touch this property. You can have a property in between owned by somebody else, but it's off premise, does say a reasonable distance. You can't put it way out in the country. But it does not eliminate the parking requirement. It just gives those two exception areas the option of taking on-site plus off-site parking to come up with the correct total. Point being, the parking requirement is still there. It's just where can you put it? These two exceptions can go off-site, whereas anybody else in town can't. That makes sense? Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Nick Tiber from 1709 Clay Street. I just wanted to reflect a little bit because I think sometimes we don't understand the problems that face us and then also the solutions that might be right in our face or in your packet today. For the last 10 years or so, we've been working with a common problem. I think everyone knows it. It's rental proliferation. And that's where we have this proliferation of single-family home conversion in traditional neighborhoods. It's been a really, really tough problem for councils, and I think it didn't even go through the Planning and Zoning Commission. But this is where, because of market demand, single-family homes are converted into rental houses, and people don't like to have rental houses sometimes next to owner-occupied homes. Well, I think sometimes we don't understand, but that's actually a function of supply and demand. When we convert single-family homes into rental homes, they're meeting a market demand. When we build vertically like this, I think the developer's trying to meet a market demand. I think maybe one of our problems that we have today is that our current planning and zoning really does very little to encourage this type of development. That's the reason why we haven't seen a whole lot of it. We've seen a lot of garden-style apartments where you might have 3-story apartment complexes surrounded by a sea of parking, required parking for the most part, with scattered garages all about. But we rarely see this type of development. So I want to encourage you to think about maybe some of the problems that we have. This is big picture stuff. Rental proliferation, we've tried to solve it with enhanced or interrogating like code enforcement, hard surface parking requirements. We've tried to limit rental demand by occupancy restrictions, which is ironic because it does the exact opposite thing. I think we want to see this as a solution, and there's only one zoning classification that allows us to build according to this standard, the developer's model, where it has a limited parking requirement, if any at all. This is evolutionary, okay, and this is actually in demand right now. And I encourage you to look at this and think that maybe this actually, while it's changed, it's a little bit different, it's bigger, it's bolder than what we would normally do, it might actually start solving problems in traditional neighborhoods too. And I also might add, not every single tenant wants to pay for a parking space, okay? And not every single tenant's going to bring a car to their residential unit. I think we have to accommodate all kinds of lifestyles, and if we make maybe slight modifications to our parking policies, where today, for the most part, throughout the city, it is actually free, and anything that's free is overused, perhaps that's part of the problem too. So think about all these things as you make a decision. I love this project. I think it's a very high quality development, has interesting use of materials, different deflection points on the building itself. It has actually underground parking. We haven't seen that in a long time. This is exciting. I think we should just let it go. And, maybe the lesser regulations could be solutions to some of our problems in more regulated areas.
Any additional comments?
Hello, my name's Dave Deibler. I live at 1616 Campus Street. I own a couple properties up on College Hill. I just want to make sure the conversation that we have tonight includes those of us that are in favor of this development. And I think I agree with the previous speaker that it is different than what's there now, but what's there now has been stuck in a bit of a time lag, a time bubble. It's a neighborhood for like 12 years. We had a hole on our main thoroughfare in our main block. So we've almost seen negative growth, and I think we have some catching up to do. So I think a development like this is sorely needed, and I really think, I wouldn't say we're a neighborhood in crisis, but we're certainly a vulnerable neighborhood, especially if you look like what's going on south of town and downtown. We need to get closer to where those areas are like. I'm not saying that we're going to have similar development, but I can't speak to some of the more technical issues that some of the people have brought up today, but if this is up to code, I just strongly urge you to pass it. Thank you.
Andy Footman. I live at 422 North Ellen Street. I'm from Sidecar Coffee. I sent you all a letter. I just wanted to reiterate what I had to say. I think Sidecar is going to be a big winner here. With this project, I think the Hill in general will be a big winner. Urban Flats has been great. There was a house there that did not look very nice, was bad for our whole area. It's torn down. We have a beautiful new building. I think that there's the winners in this project. There are a lot of people that are going to win, and it's possible that it'll crowd out some of the least desirable rental properties, and I think that it's possible that we could also see that as a win. So anyway, I'm just a big fan.
Cara Bigelow Baker, 1826 Quail Run Lane, and I also work at the Razor's Edge on College Hill. I don't think that anybody here disagrees that this project is needed, that it is a decent project, that it's an improvement. I think the only true argument really is about the parking. And to discuss some of the topics that have been brought up in the past regarding parking. You guys received a letter from the College Hill Partnership requesting that a parking study be done. I'm not sure why that's been ignored. There was some question as to whether information that I provided was true and accurate about parking and how Urban Flats has affected the city parking lot. I would like to submit this documentation. It's directly from the UNI's website. I also spoke to Carol at the UNI Parking Division, and this is a copy of the letter that I'm sure you all have from Chris Olson from Urban Flats, which is flawed. He states that off-campus students are eligible for B-lot, C-lot, or R-lot parking passes. They are not eligible for C-lot parking passes. They are eligible for B-lot passes. B-lots are open from 7 a.m. until 1 a.m. So that's not overnight. They are eligible for R-lot passes. R-lot does permit overnight parking. With a B-pass, students can also park in, or with an R-lot pass, students can also use B-lots and A-lots after 4 p.m. But again, those lots close at 1 a.m. So the only overnight parking for a student that lives off campus is an R-lot. And the only R-lots that are available are off of 27th Street and the back lot by the Unidome, which, according to Google Maps, is at least a half a mile or more from Urban Flats or the 22nd Street project. So my point is that if there is not parking provided for the students who do have cars, which there are many, if not close to all, they will have nowhere to park besides the city lot, which is already full. The street parking is minimal, if any, around that area and is already overcrowded. On January 10th, 9 residents from Urban Flats were asked about their parking. They were asked if they owned cars. 8 of those 9 tenants stated that they did own cars. All 8 of those tenants stated that they parked in the city parking lot. And one of those tenants continued to state that she has been told that the landlord owns 15 spaces in that city lot. I'm going to assume that that is not true because it's a city lot. There has been no legitimate precedent set to approve a building like this one with no parking. Using the phrase that you have to approve or allow because of a precedent is usually made by those who never intended to follow the rules, guidelines, or in this case, the law. I believe that when the approval of Urban Flats was given, that 51% of commercial space was not just commercial space. I think that there was stairwell use included, utility room use included. You can document that for yourselves. The zoning ordinances, especially in overlay districts, have been set to protect these areas because they have special characteristics. Both downtown Cedar Falls and College Hill exist in a delicate balance that are unique to each area. Neither area has the privilege of open sprawling spots to add a giant parking lot like other developing areas of town. If you continue to disrupt the parking availabilities in these overlays, business occupancy will decline. The Great Wall building currently has 2 spaces still for lease. It's not surprising that when I talk to other businesses around town and ask them, have they ever considered coming to College Hill, that they state, 1, rental space in the new area is too high to rely completely on walk-up traffic because there's no parking for customers who would have to drive in. That's what I'm faced with. Our customers live and work in Cedar Falls, and they drive to the Hill. They need a place to park. I had a customer Friday morning around 9:20 that drove around for 8 minutes looking for a place to park. That's not unusual. It's your obligation to follow these ordinances. This project is not a commercial project. The primary use of this building is overwhelmingly for residential apartment rentals. Any way you slice or dice it, you can see that this is an R4 project, and you have an obligation to restrict it as such with setbacks and parking. If you follow city staff recommendations for approval, you are following in their footsteps and continuing to harm the College Hill neighborhood area and ultimately the taxpayers of Cedar Falls who will have to pay to remedy the overcrowded parking caused by developers who don't provide parking for their tenants. Documentation has been shown, it's been proved, that these college students have cars, they own cars. You can't force that change upon them. We are not Iowa City. We are a suitcase campus. These kids go home on the weekends. They don't stick around for the summer. They want their cars. You cannot give a commercial permit to a residential building.
Good evening. I'm Dennis Bigelow, 3909 Beaver Ridge Circle, Cedar Falls. I've given this a lot of thought, and first of all, I'd like to congratulate Mr. Dahlstrom on his project and the things that he's done for the Cedar Valley and the surrounding area. But I do have some concerns about the project because of the definition, whether it is commercial or residential. What I would like to see would be a collaborative effort between the city and the developer in resolving a problem that I think is pretty clear to everybody, that for this area to develop and to grow, to benefit the entire community, the parking circumstances need to be addressed. Now, does that mean somehow working with the university? Does it mean working with the city and the developer to see if there's some other parking available off-site, as was brought up earlier? But I would caution you that if the problem is not addressed now, you open a door that's hard to close for future developments. And I don't think there's anybody in this room that will argue with the fact that, you know, the concept is a good one. Bringing more commercial space to the hill is a good idea. Making upscale apartment or residential beds available is a good idea. But the reality is we have to figure out how to handle the parking issue, and that's only going to grow. So if the city and the developer and perhaps the university can find a way to work together and move forward on that basis, I think then you have a win-win for everybody. Thanks for listening.
I see no other comments. We'll go ahead and close the public comment period. And at this point, I invite the applicant, if there's any response you'd like to make to any of the public comments being made, if you'd like to come up and address those.
Madam Speaker, members of the Commission, Larry James. Appreciate all the comments. Obviously, there's a lot of people that care about their city, and that's why we're here. I think we've got to go back to, again, looking at, I guess, ask yourself, what was it that caused the city to develop a plan and create a zoning code that is really an exception to the rest of Cedar Falls? You're not going to have this in certain other parts of the city. And that's because if you look at the zoning code and you look at the comp plan and everything that's gone into College Hill, it's really encouraging walkable mixed-use development. And I think my client has heard the concerns of the neighbors, has decreased the number of beds. If you look at the count, the count's come down significantly from number of beds, which I think is much more appropriate count than the number of rooms, number of apartments, because it indicates how many people are actually going to live there. And you've got increased the number of parking spaces. So again, I think the number of people have asked and commented that they ask you to follow the code, and that's exactly what we're asking, and encourage you to adopt staff's recommendation and respectfully pass the site plan. Thank you.
At this point, we'll bring it back to the commission for discussion. Any questions of city staff or of applicant or asking for any other clarifying information?
Well, I guess I can start here. The building itself, I think, it looks great. You've got a solid look to it. The construction materials, we don't see any things like EFS some of the lesser expensive finishings. You've got metal and good brick content. So the building itself, from my perspective, I think it's very, it'd be awesome if we can figure out how to get this done. I think we have heard all of the comments on the parking situation. I think the effort here is to put a full underground parking with, how many spaces were under there again? Do we?
47 underground.
That is not an insignificant investment to provide that level of parking in that location. I agree with some of the comments about maybe reducing the conversion of homes in that area from single family, what's left, to multi-unit pieces. Trying to get the population more concentrated in that neighborhood, I think, is a really a good deal. I think it's very important to the Hill to have the local area walkable and have people visit those locations. I think it's just the right thing to do there. I guess the only question I've got is I guess this can go probably one of two ways. If we end up with a whole parking requirement, the building just simply would be shorter. That's probably one solution. Or that there's another safety valve kind of arrangement where there's a remote parking lot. So that's all on the assumption that we really do have a parking problem, or there's more people that have cars than anticipated here. So I'm a little bit torn on where this goes. From my perspective, do you offer another valve or location as we find out that there's an overflow that's not manageable? Or do we start out right now and limit the building size and cut down how many beds would be potentially there? So I'm a little torn on what to think about, how to deal with this if we are all assuming that there is a parking problem. Okay? So that's Brian's comments.
I have a question for city staff. It's clear that the zoning is open to some interpretation. Here we've heard a couple of sides, right? We know that we need to clarify some things, probably in the zoning, and my understanding is that we're moving toward that. Is it the intent of the city, long-term, to approve projects like this, and to clarify the zoning to allow projects like this?
Well, that's hard to say. So next on the agenda, or further on the agenda, is looking at some ordinance revisions, but staff isn't necessarily recommending one way or the other. We're throwing out some options and wanting to get feedback on it. So at this point, I don't think the staff feels one way or the other on wanting to see more of these types of developments. Again, what we're going off of is past interpretations in the ordinance, the C3 district, the College Hill overlay, and what it talks about, accessory residential uses on upper floors, and in the College Hill district talks about not requiring parking. So again, do we want to see development like this? The ordinance is a little unclear in some aspects, and so we are looking to potentially move that forward to try to gain more clarity. But again, that's up to discussion and what options and where the city wants to go based on feedback from the public and the Planning Commission as we start to introduce that topic.
I have two questions for the city, just for clarification. As I look at the map, how far to the west from this property does R3 begin? And what are the parking requirements for R3?
Okay, I'm going to flip over to one of the first slides, if that gets put up on the screen. So the aerial photo there on the right, so in yellow is the property. There's a red line, one parcel to the left of that. That is the boundary between C3 and R3. So there is one property to the west, which is not owned by the developer. That's another privately owned property that is zoned C3, and then everything west of that is R3. And then your second question about if this was an R3, yeah, then you're looking at your traditional parking standards that call for 2 spaces per unit and then 1 space additional for every bedroom above 2. So you would require 3 stalls for a 3-bedroom, 4 stalls for a 4-bedroom, and so on.
Thank you.
I guess that, my feelings I've expressed before, I think is, we got to be fair about this and look at the intent. C3 is intended for commercial use, and is basically we've been trying to protect the commercial use. I mean, at one point, I think, we weren't trying to get any, wasn't going to allow residential years ago in C3. And the precedent we have for commercial, or for residential in a C3 is the residential has parking requirement. We have parking for all that. I think we have to maintain that to be consistent. And there's also the fairness issue, mentioning that, there's R3 a lot away. If you're trying to build the same exact project on that, one lot over, there's clearly a full parking requirement for that in the R zone. And, that's a huge difference. It's in dollars. If you're talking 50-some stalls and you're doing structured parking, that could be $1 million difference in your project. How can I have two different developers doing the same thing, have, totally different requirements? Is the parking requirement right? Well, you can argue one way or the other. I think that's something that could be open for discussion, but I don't think we can go in on this project and change it. You've got to change the parking requirement for everybody, and then a project can happen. We can talk about that, but the way we're sitting right now, I don't think it's fair at all to allow this to have, only half the parking that any other project pretty much in the city would be required to have. It's basic fairness. And C3 is intended for commercial. The idea is to try to protect commercial and not pile a whole bunch of residential in there. So, based on all that, I just can't see a way that we can approve this as is.
Marty, so can you,
Commissioner,
go ahead.
Commissioner, this is Leanne Saul. Can I speak?
Please.
I still think we have to go back to what the zoning ordinance says, and when I get back to what it says, in those cases where residential use is permitted and said use serves as the principal use on an individual property, that residential use will be governed by minimum lot area. In addition, all of these applicable requirements pertaining to improvements or new construction of any principal permitted residential use should conform to all the right parking and setbacks, etc. I maintain that the primary use, principal use, main use of this property is residential. And therefore, it reverts to R4 zoning ordinance, just as our ordinance says. And so that is my argument and why I would not support this project as it is. I love the project. I think we need something like this. But until we, as a city, change our ordinances, it would not be right to approve this one. Thank you.
Staff, do you want to address that at all in terms of Ms. Saul's interpretation of the principal use versus any comments on that? Or
Again, going back to the staff report, which talks about how staff has interpreted that in the past about main floor area determining the principal use. So back in November when this was first before the commission, they had a first floor area of, I'd have to go back, I think 18% commercial, and the rest of it was residential. So at that time, staff did deem that a principal residential use. And then in January 10th, the last meeting, between those two meeting dates, the applicant submitted a revised plan which showed the main floor area 64% commercial with the rest residential. Therefore, based on those past interpretations that staff has made of it being more than the 50% main floor commercial, we then looked at this as a commercial building. And therefore is governed by the C3 district and not the R4.
But there's nothing in the code that says that's the measure. I mean, that's just been kind of a thing that's evolved over time to try to deal with some ambiguity. And I go back to what Leanne said. You look at it, it's a residential use. I mean, there's just, you can't have 80+% residential and not call that the primary use. That just doesn't make any sense.
I would agree it is residential. I would also agree that these are kind of projects that we want to be moving toward.
Yeah.
That indeed our zoning kind of requirements, they discourage projects like this. And I think this is the direction that we need to be moving as a progressive city toward density. I know everyone doesn't like the parking, parking is an issue, but all the great places that we all go to on the weekend if we want to leave town are progressive kind of dense places, right? And this is where people want to be. So I agree with the ambiguity of the zoning. I personally would support the project because it, I think, is where we need to be moving toward. And I hope that our requirements and our zoning changes clarify some of those pieces.
I would concur with that completely. And we are working to revisit this code. And I hope that we get to be a part of that and an integral piece of that, because I hate, I'd hate to see this city reduce these areas in town where we set ourselves apart in the wrong direction for what every other growing community is doing. We're taking away, if we take away the C3, we're taking away our ability to have projects like this. There's no other zoning in town that would allow a project like this. There's just not. And so I'd hate to see that when we do revisit this code that this zoning goes away or gets changed or is required to park, when every community that is growing is doing the opposite. I'm just a little curious what everybody's thinking on the facts here about parking. Do we have any facts that there's a parking problem? I mean, there's people's interpretations, there's perceptions, but there's no facts. There's been no study that there's a parking problem on the Hill. And I just fear that we're making this based on speculation. And that was number 2 that I had. And I did my own small parking survey, if you will. I gave that to staff this week, and I encourage you guys to do all the same. I'm not going to tell any figures about it, but I encourage you guys all to do your due diligence on these projects. I just don't see that there's a parking problem.
Other comments or questions for staff?
Well, I happen to like this project. I think the density is good and fits College Hill area. And I think this deserves a vote, so I would move to approve.
There's a motion to approve the project as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
There's a second, either from Mr. Liebert or Mr. Ernst. Okay. There's a motion and a second. Please go ahead and register your vote. Ms. Leanne, are you able to give us a verbal vote?
Nay.
That's a nay. Sorry, Leanne, is that a negative or a nay or a yay?
No.
Oh, thank you. So it looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 yeses on that item, and
4 noes.
Leanne's 4 noes. City staff, correct me, that's enough to approve this item and move it on to City Council?
That's correct. The next city council meeting is the first Monday in February. I think that's February 5th. I don't have a calendar right in front of me, but
It is.
we anticipate most likely sending it to council either the 5th or the next meeting. If everything's in order, Monday, February 5th would be the likely time we move this to city council.
And a quick notice, as we've had some discussion beginning this evening in our next agenda items, we do have discussion of zoning ordinance items and language that I think a lot of this will feed into and build into that discussion. And just another thank you to everyone who's commented and brought information to the commission on this agenda item. With that, we will move on to our new business items, the first of which is zoning ordinance discussion of the Central Business District Overlay Amendments introduction. And this is Ms. Lehman, who would introduce this one.
Thank you. So I'd like to start by defining what overlay zoning is. So an overlay zone is a regulatory tool that creates a special zoning district over existing base zones, which identifies additional provisions on top of what the zones are in that district that help protect a special resource or guide development within that zone. So the Central Business District overlay, which is outlined in orange here in the image on the slide, encompasses the downtown and provides guidance for buildings, site designs, standards, maintenance, and development within that district. So staff have been working very closely with Community Main Street's Design Committee over the past few months, reviewing the Central Business District overlay on ways to improve it and really to revisit it. So the point, I guess, the purpose of this presentation is really an introduction to some of the ideas we've had and kind of to initiate an initial discussion with the Commission on the direction and thoughts of these areas. So at this time, again, initial discussion, and then based on what we hear from you today, we'll come back in the future with text amendments that can be looked at into more detail. Karen Smith from the Historical Society is here with us today as well. She is a representative of the Community Main Street Design Committee with us today, who will help me answer any questions if some come up. So really the two, in essence, the two main reasons why these code updates are in front of you today is really one, a desire to clarify the process of review for projects that are in the Central Business District, and two, looking at the applicability and threshold of the review criteria of those projects in the zoning district. So to clarify the review process, there's really two parts of that discussion. The first, removing projecting signs from substantial improvement definition is really just an opportunity, since we're updating the code, that staff would like to amend in this section. And really, since signage or projecting signage is seen as a substantial improvement, it triggers that any new sign, projecting sign over a sidewalk, has to go through P&Z and City Council, and that can be a whole month-long review for applicants. Staff sees this as unnecessary, as there are codes in place regarding projecting sign standards. So we're requesting that at this time, since we're modifying the code section for this overlay, that be considered as well, that projecting signs be removed from that definition, so it does not have to go through the process through P&Z and Council. And really the main point, B, is clarifying Community Main Street's role in the review process for projects in the Central Business District. So really, in the past, Community Main Street has informally become part of the review process and reviewed by staff and the Commission as a recommending body for projects that were in this overlay. Community Main Street has decided that they would like to be viewed and used as a resource for individuals in the district and not be an authority figure for the review process. So they do not want to be part of the review in that sense. So it really puts a greater responsibility on staff and the commission when reviewing these submissions for this district, as their initial feedback won't be given to us till later. They'd be seen as the general public, so come at the commission time. So really, this is the main reason why it's respurring kind of our revisiting this section of the code to look at the criteria to provide staff and the commission some more guidance and objectivity to the visions of what the central business district should be in the future. So again, really providing more details for us to follow moving forward. So before I move on to the 2 section, are there any questions or comments regarding, I guess, those 2, the clarifying the process of review at this time? Okay.
Sound good to me.
Okay. So moving on, so applicability and threshold of the review criteria. So A and B kind of follow the same suit as A of the previous section. It's something that, since we are updating the code, we thought we'd take the opportunity to update. So the first one clarifies an inconsistency in parking in this overlay. So it's really just making sure it's consistent and kind of cleaning up some language. That's what A is. B is something that we'd like to consider to provide additional flexibility for new buildings within the district. So as of right now, when you build a new building, it currently has to meet current building code standards. So for instance, certain areas of the district are not in C3 zoning, so they have setbacks, 25-foot front yard and things like that. So in these older neighborhoods, they were built after our ordinance or before our ordinance was put in place. So they were built without setbacks. You go down streets and they're, right up to the property lines, right up to the sidewalk, if not 5 feet or so. So what we'd like to propose is that instead of, let's say, God forbid, one of these buildings burns down and they have to be rebuilt, that they have to meet those setbacks, rather than do that, provide a provision saying, hey, you can look at the buildings around you and match their setbacks to be consistent with the district, consistent with that block. So that's something we'd like to propose as an option for that district to help initiate development and keep kind of the feel of the district similar as it expands in those areas, or if replacements need to happen. So that's A and B. So before I move on to C, and this is where really kind of the meat of the discussion will come, and it'll be the next slides, are there any questions on those two points? See, no? Okay. So currently, the Central Business District overlay has 8 categories that are reviewed within the facade review section of the code, and they're listed here. Each section provides guidelines for what to consider on new projects or redevelopments or, maintenance issues of projects. So I have provided for you, you should each have a copy of the current Central Business District Code in front of you, just to kind of maybe follow along or see as we go through. And it is available online for those watching or interested in maybe looking at it later. So as mentioned before, staff has been working very closely with Community Main Streets Design Committee to provide more objective and more objectivity and more guidance to these sections as we move forward. So after moving the code, we do have a number of proposed changes. So what I'd like to do is walk through each section, and then on the sections that we really are requesting changes or considering changes in, kind of pausing and seeing if we can have any recommendations or discussion on those items. Again, preliminary, just to kind of gauge if we're going in the right direction. And then really what we're going to do is the main areas that I'd like to discuss is the proportion section, pattern, materials and textures, and color. The others are remaining relatively the same, or are the same as they were in the past, but I'll walk through each point just for point of understanding. So before I'd like to start, I'd like to remind the Commission that these changes will ultimately be something that we will have to enforce for all projects that do come through, and they will shape the future of the development in this area. So just something to think about, what your vision is this appropriate, not appropriate? Could you see it happening, not happening in this area, just as we move on? Again, initial discussion, initial thoughts, so you can, think about it too, and we can come back to it in more detail later. So the first section, proportion, in the code is really just one sentence. It says, "The width and height of adjacent buildings shall be considered in the construction or alteration of a building." So this current description is very open to interpretation, very subjective. So this is something that both staff and Community Main Street really wanted to look into. And really, the ultimate goal is we would like to encourage density and height in the downtown, but still be respectful to the existing buildings and character of the district. Now, this is a hard balance that, how do you do that? And one idea that we had that we'd like to run by you is really to provide a minimum and maximum height or stories for different areas of the district. For example, the core having different guidelines or minimums and maximums versus the area outside of the core. And really, in response to that, a minor thing being changing the title of that section to massing, as that's really more what we're trying to get at, this specific section, looking at building form and size. So again, just trying to get initial thoughts. What is your initial reaction or thoughts in this area? Or maybe feedback that we can take.
What are you thinking about for the core?
So it's different. So that's the thing, it's... And I didn't want to get into specifics. We do have certain numbers in mind, but I didn't want to...
that kind of, because C3 right now, basically, you can go...
Everything.
Is there a limit at all?
Again, the only limit is that you need to consider what's around it. So there is no real limit in terms of height.
Yeah, but C3's always been no limits, and then, these things were kind of layered in at a later date anyways, and so that's kind of in my mind, that's kind of using a backdoor approach to height anyways by doing proportion or whatever, that type of thing. So if you want to have a height limit, I think you just need to have a height limit. Because are you, massing, are you going to say, we have only 2 stories here, so now we can't build 5 stories right next door,
Well, and that's a discussion. So I'm going to just quickly jump back to the first slide I had of the district. So the overlay does not just consist of the main downtown strip, so the main street. It goes further, to the both east, west, and north. So it kind of constitutes that entire area. So yes, we would like to see the potential of higher buildings more toward the core, and maybe taper down as it gets toward the residential as you go further out. So that's a discussion too. So maybe just saying, hey, cap it at 4 stories throughout isn't really something that we want to do for areas close to residential areas. So saying maybe areas along Main are...
See, I thought maybe you'd be looking at capping the height on the Main Street because you're kind of protecting that historic...
That is also something we're considering, yes. So maybe along Main Street, it's...
You don't want a 6-story right in the middle of, on 3rd and Main, necessarily, because everything else is 2 and 3 stories. That's kind of what I thought we were maybe heading with that direction to
it includes
kind of
that,
preserve
yes.
that in historic integrity, if you will.
Okay, yes.
But I don't know if it's right or not, but I'm just...
And that's what we're asking for discussion on, because that is something that we are considering, and but again, I wanted to get your thoughts on the height discussion. Is that something, do we want to have minimums and maxes? Is
I don't know
the
that,
direction?
I don't personally feel that there's a need for a height restriction in C3. If we're going to have, where else,
The only problem is that the overlay supersedes everything in the C3 district. So the C3 district may not have a height restriction, but the overlay says, well, it takes the next step and
so
says...
have we gone kind of crazy, though, that we have an overlay? The overlay goes over the whole C3 district, right?
It goes over the C3 district, there's R4, there's C2,
Yeah.
I think there's C1.
But all of the C3 is under the overlay, so it's
Yes.
like, why don't we just have an ordinance that says C3 is, this, and not have to have an overlay on top of that, too?
Right, but then the point would be too, for instance, in the C3 district, like you were saying, do we want to be able to respect those historic buildings, that main core on Main Street, without having any type of restriction? You could have all of a sudden a 9, 10-story building pop up right on.
I could see a rationale for having some restriction there if we're trying to protect an asset, the historic asset there, but I don't know.
That makes sense, Marty. I think that Main Street from 1st to 6th, where we've got more or less, I think that is that the historical district definition? Like 1st to 6th? maybe follow that pattern wherever we got that designation and there is a height restriction? No higher than what's already there? Whatever that means.
Or some limit within the relative.
Yeah, and obviously we're not very far away. How many blocks away are we? We got the new developments that are along the river that are significantly taller, and those are probably in the appropriate place. I think they look good, and they're separated from the rest of the main street. It's a reasonable transition.
Any other thoughts on height from the other commission members?
This is Leanne Saul. May I make a comment?
Yep. Go ahead, Leanne.
In thinking about minimums and maximums, we just had a lengthy discussion about C3 and parking requirements. So I guess my concern is if we have no restrictions on height of buildings, will we have the same problem downtown as we think we have on College Hill regarding parking? So if we allow a 6-story building on Main Street, let's say on the corner of 4th and Main, that empty lot, and the first floor is commercial and the rest is residential, and there are no parking requirements, are we going to get ourselves in another problem?
The answer to that, sorry?
I would want to consider what we're doing here if we're going to allow no restriction and no parking, et cetera.
So the difference between the Central Business District and the College Hill is that in the Central Business District overlay, and I have to find the sentence, but there's a specific sentence that says all secondary residential uses, more or less, I'm not getting it right verbatim, but are required to park. So we would not have the same issue the way the current code reads, because all development in the Central Business District, residential is required to park.
In their own lots?
Yes.
Which is what has been provided by the developer right now, right, Iris?
That's correct.
Yeah, okay.
It's only in this district that commercial and office is not required to park.
All right, thank you. That helps me out.
Okay. So taking that, we'll move on to the next one. Roof shape, pitch, and direction. So basically this section sounds a lot of what it is. It asks the review to consider the similarity or compatibility of the proposed roof or alteration to a roof of the areas around it. So staff and Community Main Street feels that this section doesn't really need any more clarification, so we're not recommending any changes to this section. The next section is pattern, and really this section the code looks at the pattern of solid surfaces of a building versus openings, so doors, and windows. And again, it refers to the reviewer to consider the neighboring buildings, so again, kind of leaving it open for interpretation. So in general, staff and Community Main Street felt that this section is fine the way it is, but we thought it would be important to provide more direction and more clarification on the use of windows on buildings, specifically transparency, since that's something they're really striving for in terms of a walkable downtown. Having those transparent storefronts is very important for the character. So one thing that we've recommended is adding a section for transparency and glazing, so another section of the design review, in which we would require a percentage of what the storefront or facade, how transparent that would be. So percentage of, let's say, of windows on the first floor. That's just a thought that we had in terms of keeping the character consistent and having something to point to and say, hey, we want glass, we want transparency on the first floor. What are your thoughts in that area?
Brad, you're a resident architect. What do you think?
No, it seems to make sense.
Marty?
Yeah.
An architect number 2?
I don't have any problems with that, I guess.
Okay. So something to consider. So the percentages that we're thinking about are still under discussion. So we have some time, and we'll be working on other sections of the code too. So if you want, you can think about it too. What percentage you think would be appropriate on the first floor? We have some ideas. We're throwing some numbers around, and we'll present those at the next meeting. But just something to maybe think about of, is it 50%? Is it 15%? What?
That's where been part of that discussion, like, long time ago with Community Main Street, we were looking at that. You kind of want to put those restrictions on, but at the same time, I have a hard time putting restrictions on, because as soon as you do that, something falls outside of that guideline, and it's fine, or
Special handling.
yeah, or you tend to, you tend to restrict innovation. So I don't know.
So maybe we lean on the lower end and...
Yeah.
I would say innovation changes so quickly. I mean, people are doing different designs today than they did 2 years ago. And if you put this 2 years ago, I think there might be some things that fall into the case today that would maybe not be used. You just never know what direction it is. So I'd hate to put those restrictions on too heavily in any aspect of it, I think.
I know you want to make it more objective, but it becomes so cut and dried that then all of a sudden sometimes you can get such a sameness, it becomes a problem too. It's hard to find that.
Or you create such a range of percentages that it's then meaningless.
Right. And it's just like, I don't know.
It's hard to...
Iris, may I say something?
Yes, go ahead.
In working with Community Main Street and going to some of the national conferences, one of the things that downtowns worry about are what they call blank spaces. So if you have your walkability and there are no windows and no doors, it discourages people from walking further or going to the next block. So in terms of first floor visibility and window or glazing, I would encourage us to be pretty restrictive about that on the first floor in those areas.
Interesting. Yeah.
And it looks like the current ordinance does have some reference to blank space. I've lost it. I saw it before in here, but...
I would agree, Leanne. I think it's important, but I think I also agree with Marty that it's hard to legislate kind of good design, but you kind of know it when you see it. So I guess as a commission member, I'd like to have the flexibility to understand that and assess that.
And something we hope to have before we present, I guess, not the final, but a text draft to you, are maybe some line illustrations of what those percentages might mean. And that might help in the discussion too, but in order to be objective, we will probably have to provide some sort of number or percentage.
Well, I don't know, is it possible to write it so there's a percentage, which is the guideline, subject to review, give like the commission and the whatever was reviewing it some latitude to make, if you get like a really good design and it doesn't fall exactly within the percentages, otherwise it's just looking to cut and dry. You check the box, it says yes or no, and then you move on.
Right, and the problem with saying, subject to commission review is basically saying, well, you can ignore the point we just said because you might be able to, convince your point otherwise. So then why even have those regulations if it's going to be brought to discussion? And it's just, we've been debating about this. I can go on and on, but it's good for things we've talked about too. They're good points.
I think all the commission members, obviously, now as we drive down Main Street, will be looking at transparency and what windows, but I think something that's helpful if you're bringing to us a range of percentages is if you can do a sampling of what we currently have. I mean, we can observe it ourselves, but for context and comparison in that discussion, to know what the present situation is, level of transparency and windows. I think that's a helpful reference for us to continue that decision making.
We can do that.
And I think with that, it would also be nice to know what the building use currently would be, because I think we've got some areas downtown that are offices that are like a door and completely brick front, right?
Yeah.
So there's some differences down there that exist today, and do you want them to not look like that? Is the point maybe, or do you want them to look more like what's at the north end of this downtown? I think we probably do if we're trying to get walkability and trying to have visibility of what's inside and what's going on. From a retail space perspective, I think you'd want that too. So I think acknowledging that there's different uses down there might be nice to see where we're at there.
Okay, any other comments? It's a good tie into the next topic. We've debated this one a lot too. Okay. Materials and textures. So this is something that we've had spent a lot of time with, and glass comes in that discussion too. It really goes hand in hand with it. But basically, the current code uses that compatibility language again, so leaves it very open to interpretation. It just has to look good or be compatible with the buildings around it. So both Community Main Street and staff felt that this section would benefit this section to get more specific in those areas. So an idea that we had was establishing percentages again of the building facade that would need to be, for instance, brick, stone, or terracotta to kind of blend in with the area. Of course, leaving room for other materials as well, like metal paneling and things like that. And even maybe going as far as prohibiting certain materials like asphalt or wood shingles. So those are just some ideas. Again, percentages are for discussion, but, again, providing more objectivity to what we're seeing and how it's growing in the downtown area. So any thoughts regarding, materials?
This almost seems like it's more subject to change as building materials evolve, and with our recent developments have presented a lot of, I'd say, new materials and styles in downtown, and I think it's been positive.
Well, again, I guess if it's on First Street, we'd probably want some continuity. I mean, not First Street, but Main Street.
Yeah.
You'd want some continuity, but as soon as you left that, I guess we'll call it the historic look, or not preservation, but historic look, you go a block to the other direction and a very modern building, which we're putting up on First and Clay, just right over here, is going to look quite substantially different than the ones that are a few blocks away. And I don't know you want to limit any more development like that, and still acknowledging the things that are on Main Street. I don't know how you do that.
So maybe it's like a zone, like we were talking about height, maybe the downtown specifically, Main from First to Sixth.
It's just another layer of things you want to go through, I guess. That's but maybe it's time to do that. Just throw that out there. Maybe it's time to protect the look that we have in that Main Street corner.
So again, initial discussion, feel free to think about it, and we can discuss it later another time too, but just again, where do we want to go with this and what direction? And I did hear, in general, is the idea of having sections, like treating different areas of the overlay differently, is that what we want to do with materials? Is that what I'm hearing?
I think that's a reasonable approach.
Yeah. Does the historical designation come into play at all in terms of what we can or can't do, or?
The nomination, so the fact that the downtown is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places, it itself is just more or less provides carrots. It provides grant opportunities for individuals, but it doesn't limit what people can do with their buildings themselves. It doesn't provide any guidelines of what you can and can't do.
There's no restrictions put on a building because it's in the historic district.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay, color, the next one. So this one,
Don't have a problem with that.
staff and Community Main Street felt strongly that we needed to provide some more objectivity to this section, to this criteria. Currently, the code, like the other sections, uses compatibility language, saying, color really should be complementing the other colors around it, which makes it very challenging to gauge and to be really to review those type of requests. So we are considering addressing this by limiting building colors to earth or neutral colors, specifying that all other colors, for example, neons, can be used as highlights to really accentuate buildings' architectural features. And we're playing with the idea of providing highlights with a percentage so that we have something to stick to. But again, with color, that's just something that we felt needed to have some more guidance beyond just look around and see what's appropriate. Because again, that changes with time. It's very, very subjective. So I guess what are your initial thoughts and comments on that topic?
Thought maybe you'd have like the abolished list of colors. Can't.
There are certain districts, not in our city, but other areas of the community, not community, but United States that have a list of, these are the 5 colors you can use.
Yeah.
That is something that we could do. I don't know if we want to go that route.
I think that's a little extreme for what we're looking at. We want to have as much flexibility, but I think I see what you're driving at. You're trying to have kind of a base color here, and then accents can be, as long as they're not too much, can be anything you want type of thing.
It's just an idea that we had, an approach.
Well, I would say that, we've had 99% of our things that we've been showing over the last 10 years have been just fine.
Yeah.
And there's a palette that seems to be pretty acceptable to anybody that wants to develop down there. And we've had a couple outliers that have had discussion, and we just, had those. So, I don't know, again, maybe it's an inventory of what we got, and not to excruciating detail, but knowing what we've got down there might be appropriate for you to know a percentage of what we have, I guess.
So you're thinking the base palette is earth tones? Is that what you're?
Neutrals or earth tones.
Or earth tones.
And that includes whites and grays and things like that. Browns and dark reds.
I guess the brick is sort of earth tone.
So again, is this restricted to Main Street area, or?
Well, again, I think we're going to see some different things. You get a few blocks away to the east and out to the west, they're going to be a lot different.
Yeah, there's a lot of projects, including the one we saw tonight, that are using louder colors,
right,
Metal
bolder
panels.
colors.
Yeah.
It's just something
Galvanized railings,
Yeah.
all that kind of thing.
It's hard to be that restrictive, but again, how do you go about it? I guess we'll have to figure that out.
I think if you're
This
able.
is Leanne. Can I talk?
Go ahead.
Personally, I think we should allow for flexibility with color. I respect the fact that we want to keep a certain historical flavor and that sort of thing, but color is also good for business, and it's inviting. And so I would hate to restrict us to always earth in neutral tones. I think if we can allow for some creativity as accent and that sort of thing, I think we should be able to do that. Thank you.
Thanks,
That's a fair
Leanne.
comment. That's good.
Yeah.
The only concern that comes up with that is if we, let's say, leave the color as is and don't provide any guidelines. Again, it becomes very subjective to the commission at the time of what's appropriate and not. And if we ever challenge it, from a legal standpoint, we have nothing to stand on. So again, to kind of protect ourselves, having more specific guidelines, whatever they are, would be helpful. But that's just something to think about.
Mm-hmm. Putting a percentage on an accent, I mean, is that something that you're talking towards? Or, I mean, that could be one way to do it, but again, the buildings that you see going up in other places that have started to use these colors more than we have locally, you do see mostly accents in parts of the building, but not most of them.
Right, it's just still a small percentage.
Right, yeah, yeah.
That's probably a reasonable way to do it, is just to put a percentage on it. And
Okay. So again, initial discussion. So we'll move forward with that, and then we can talk about it more, think about it more regarding color. So the next item, architectural features, really looks at the elements of a building, such as cornices, door styles, shutters, etc. And really, for redevelopments, this is really meant to preserve and protect the character of older buildings in the district. So that's really architectural feature to section. But in general, generally vague, just saying, again, look at the character of the neighborhood, everything around it kind of should be considered. But in general, staff and Community Main Street felt that this section was fine as is, so we're not recommending any changes to that section. Exterior murals and drawings, etc. This section really covers paintings or other works of arts that are executed on the exterior walls of a building. And currently, basically what it says is that any mural art piece is required to go through P&Z and City Council for review and approval. It doesn't really have any requirements. There's a fine line between signage requirements, which we don't allow for murals. You can't advertise your business with a mural. But in general, that's really all that it says. So we didn't have any recommendations for that section, so we left that one more or less as is for now. The last section, signage, really looks at the signage types and designs allowed in the district and provides guidance in that area. So there are some modifications that we are exploring in this section that are mainly requests from Community Main Street that are based off of their national Main Street design guidelines. And then we'll go into more detail on those at the next meeting, since those get more specific and detailed. But in general, again, I just wanted to thank you for your initial feedback and discussion on this topic. Again, this is really kind of a heads up, initial kind of bringing it up to you so that you can think about it. And as we move forward, it's a dense section. There's a lot to cover. But at this time, are there any other comments or questions regarding?
So Iris, on the next go around, will you send out some preliminary language to review beforehand?
Yes, that'll be part of the packet.
Okay.
And it may not be the next meeting, since we still have to
Yeah.
work out some details, but it'll be,
Right, whenever that is.
yes.
Slow guys like me, it takes a little while for some of that to sink in, so.
I understand. And we'll have percentages suggested, and just a note, we are working very closely with Community Main Street's Design Committee, and they do have architects and a number of members on that group. So they're giving us feedback on those percentages that they think are appropriate. So they are thought through, they're not just random, but at the same time, it's a gauge of also from your expertise what you think is appropriate. So that's something that we can delve more into, and we'll have the text for you to look at beforehand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a couple of comments. Again, I'm Karen Smith. I live at 816 Hudson Road, representing the Historical Society, but speaking on behalf of Community Main Street and their design committee. I want to thank you for taking the time to look over this overlay ordinance. Many of the proposals that we've brought before you are just the types of things that we have given as advice from our design committee in the past. So these are the types of guidance and expertise that we have brought that have made the district so successful. We did a lot of research to come up with these ideas. As you know, Community Main Street is successful because they focus on both community and economic development and historic preservation. So what we really looked at was codes across the country and other models. We want to make sure that we are encouraging innovation and interesting architectural design. The last thing we want is for the entire overlay district to start to look like Main Street and we feel like we're in Disney World or something. We want to have contrast that helps the historic buildings stand out and show their architectural beauty, and we want, but we also want it to be compatible so that it fits in and doesn't feel like it's completely out of place. So what we're trying to look at here is ways to kind of codify that so people can really measure when they're making a design and they don't feel like it's kind of an arbitrary process. I really like the idea of kind of thinking about areas and how each section is a little bit different, but I would caution that we need to be a little bit careful about thinking about the newly designated historic district. As Iris said, there are not restrictions as a part of that. It is really a way to incentivize restoration of those buildings. People can get tax credits if they follow certain restrictions. And it also builds a lot of community pride. And we assured people time and again that there are no restrictions to those. So if we start tying code to the historic district, then now we're creating a very fraught situation, because we're basically saying, now that you were given this wonderful reward and this wonderful designation, now we're going to restrict you further for being a part of something that was meant to be celebratory. So I think that's something we need to look at, is if we are to break out different sections and kind of define them separately. I do caution that we want to be very careful that we don't say that anyone who's in the newly designated district has to follow different guidelines than other people. So I think that would be it. But thanks for thinking about this, and I think it'll be a great process to move forward.
Thank you. Anything else on that one? Go on to our next item of new business, a second item on the zoning ordinance. This is to begin a discussion on principal and accessory secondary use. And Mr. Sturch.
Thank you, Ms. Overly. Yes, as the last item, I just want to introduce some elements and ideas to start to consider for some maybe some ordinance amendments regarding some of these developments we're talking about, these mixed-use developments. And these are all areas within the C3 district, which is basically the downtown area in the College Hill district. So as part of that, we still want to promote that existing commercial district for those commercial uses. Not a lot of commercial districts in town, so we want to maintain that use and for those types of developments. Again, start that mixed-use development idea. You know, that's kind of the new thing coming in. You know, part of our comprehensive goals talks about people living in downtown and promote walkable neighborhoods and continue that retail expansion. So I just kind of pulled out some of those elements out of the comprehensive plan. We want to just, again, maintain that street level commercial use and develop those variety of housing types, you know, that are conveniently located in those commercial areas and near those civic activities in downtown areas. And so along with that, staff kind of threw out 3 ideas for these types of mixed-use developments in the C3 district, and I want to kind of explain all 3. These are 3 different ideas. So item number 1, if you take the building as a whole, calculate the area, all floors, looking at that 50-50 mix. So 50% or greater commercial, retail, office type use, and the other half would be residential. So if you have a four-story building, 2 floors are commercial, and then the other 2 floors are residential. That's one idea, you know, to start to develop language with that. The other idea is just to, again, take a look at that first floor or the street level area and just apply a commercial use only. Now, again, when I talk about commercial, I mean commercial retail, office, or restaurant, that type of commercial use, storefronts, that type of thing. And then along with that, if you want to park the upper or place parking under that building footprint, that area should be compensated or developed on the upper floor. So again, you're still having that equal split on the main floor for that upper floor commercial use. So again, let me explain that again. If you have a commercial use, the majority is commercial on the main floor, but if parking is introduced for the residential side of it, that area under the building for parking has to be placed on the upper floor for commercial use. So you're going to compensate that area. And then the last idea is to calculate the area on the street level area floor, and then just say the majority of that would be set in commercial area, commercial space. So we're looking at a mixed-use building, focus on the main floor, and the majority of that is commercial. Any comments? I see a lot of kind of blank stares.
Well, I certainly think that this is related to our earlier discussion, and we do need to better define what accessory is.
Well, I kind of wanted to get into more describing the building as opposed to what's principal, what's accessory. It is like that, but it does say in the code, if the main floor street level is commercial, you can have residential on the upper floors. It kind of expands that idea. So again, taking a look at more of these other elements. Along with that, if all residential units, I'm talking about units, should be established on upper floors. So again, maintain that commercial space on the street level, and if you want residential, keep it on the second or higher floors.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Yes.
That's
I do too.
a minimum.
And that's on the slide here if they want to.
Slide that
These are
we're on.
additional considerations. So residential dwelling units to be established on upper floors of a commercial structure. Also, the residential use comply with the parking guidelines. And we can throw in exceptions. Maybe there's a minimum number of units / bedrooms. Take example, if you want to remodel or rehab an existing building, a contributing building in a historic district, so above Toads, maybe there's just room for 2 or 3 units, residential units on that second floor. Well, there's no place to park it. So idea is to say, hey, do we want to just say 1, 2, or 3 units? You don't have to park it, and anything over 3 or 4 more, you need to put parking. So that could be more in the lines of new development if there's four units or multi-level units. That's when we have to introduce the parking requirements for the residential area. Just kind of piggyback on what Iris said in the previous discussion, C3 district downtown doesn't have parking requirements for residential. We've applied the parking requirements based on the State Street, for example, the development. As we assembled those lots for development of mixed use, a condition is that would be residential parking must be provided. So it kind of started with that State Street on that, and that was kind of a separate development idea. So again, looking at these ordinance changes and amendments, we kind of want to go on that track is defining those areas and setting up those parking requirements. Again, that last item, bulleted item under there is all parking under the building must be placed behind that street level storefront. So we want to have the storefronts along the sidewalks there, and the parking is essentially hidden in the back of the building. So that would be another
I wouldn't,
idea.
I mean, I wouldn't mind not just having no parking, at what that commercial level is, because I think it needs to be commercial. I mean, it could be underground, below grade or whatever, but I don't know.
What do you think about the suggestion, though, of making up that lost commercial space of the parking on a second floor or a higher floor? So we're not losing overall commercial space.
Right. I mean, our C3, we don't have much C3, in this town. There's very little. And so
2 spots.
and the part of the hill that's actually C3 is tiny.
It's pretty small.
It's pretty tiny. I mean, you just talk about,
Now we're throwing out the idea of what's under the building. Let's say the building only occupies half the lot. If it's exposed parking in the back, maybe that doesn't qualify as that. So the parking, that essentially allows assembly of lots to put together. Let's say the building's on one lot, but the adjacent property is intended for parking. So we're just kind of talking about area in the building, underneath the building. So if we want to encourage that, we want to make sure that the majority of that building space on the main floor is commercial.
Right,
But you may want to have some parking under the building, is what I'm saying.
right, because if you put parking underneath the footprint of the building on your main floor, you're making a dead zone in your neighborhood. I mean, it just is. It's a total, nobody wants to walk by the parking empty parking garage going between stores or whatever.
Okay.
I just think, again, staying consistent with what I've said the whole time, I think this 50% use restricts the redevelopment. It's so expensive to redevelop today that there's so many people across the country that aren't requiring any parking. And I just would like, I'm just purely curious, where do we get these guidelines? Are these researched in handbooks? Are they parking studies? Are they, what are they that we're getting these guidelines for percentages for parking, percentages for, when the code was last updated, what was used to determine that?
For like the type of use and how many parking stalls.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It just pretty much carries over from
previous.
From previous code, 1971. Yeah, they're old, outdated codes.
We're 45, 48 years past that now. I mean, that's crazy that we do that.
And those carry into the type of use. If it's a gas station or if it's a rental unit, there's on the rental side of it. Hey, there's a public demand for parking stalls and
sure, yeah, and that kind of stuff, absolutely.
Yep.
I think if you just look at what other growing towns are doing, I'd be shocked if you see parking studies and these dissertations that these people are doing, how far away we are from these towns and parking restrictions. I've read so many of these in the last 2 weeks since we've had our last discussion, and there's towns talking about putting maximum requirements on parking, and that leading to people being discouraged from using automobiles and getting on their bikes and having these parking lots half a mile away, having bike racks in these parking lots, biking to their units, and then in this College Hill neighborhood, I mean, there's so much someone can do if they live in that neighborhood. You can eat, you can get your hair cut, you can have nightlife, you can go to Quick Start and you can get your groceries, you can get your milk. I mean, you don't really need to leave that area unless you're working. And those people are working, I get that. And it rains, and if you're that far away, I mean, it's not perfect, but I think that's the direction the world is going today. And it's just not, I don't think we should be different than that, in my opinion.
And what I would say is that I think that there may be some very good reasons for the density and to get away from the cars and do more walking, but then we need to look at not just C3,
Right.
we need to look at the residential, because as I mentioned before, the building 2 lots down from the building earlier this evening would have to meet the parking requirements.
Right.
But this building doesn't. So we need to look at changing the parking requirements for the residential units. If our goal is to reduce parking, to encourage walking, et cetera, less cars, then we need to expand that district that doesn't have a required parking.
Absolutely.
So that gets me to my next question, which is probably a little farther out of field, but yeah, in the CIP, I saw dollars in there for the code, the zoning ordinance rewrite. I mean, to the point, this is 1971 base code. Sometimes, is that gonna start this year? I mean, are we just putting a Band-Aid on this now, or is, a total redo within the foreseeable future that we can actually, come clean with some of these things?
Please tell us there is.
I think we had this question when we had the joint commission city council meeting to discuss the CIP. That same question came up of when are we going to get started on the zoning ordinance? And I said then, we know that the commission's been eager to get that done for a number of years. What we've seen is a variety of staff changes happening over that time, which have impacted consistency in order to get that going. So we do hope that this year we'll be through some of that and be able to get that started. And that will be a lengthy process because we'll be evaluating every part of the code. So one of our ideas is to maybe start with a little bit on that in relation to maybe the efficiency units. And we have this throughout town where we have some efficiency, smaller units. And right now our zoning code says 2 spaces per unit. That's where you start, that's your minimum. So should efficiencies or 1 bedrooms maybe just at this point be amended to allow 1 parking space for those types of uses, and then a 2 bedroom is 2 spaces and on. And then when we do the overall, we look at that and look at studies and inform our discussion more at that point.
So, I mean, you're saying we're just doing Band-Aids now, because otherwise, I mean, we could, one thing leads to the other, you know, to Brian's point, it's like, well, it brings up the next question on that, and
We've had Band-Aids since 1971, yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think you maybe go farther back than that. One of these buildings were put up, the person that owned the store lived upstairs.
Right.
You know, and that's the whole College Hill, and that's the whole downtown. So there was, the residents were people that worked down below. So, you know, you allowed the residential thing to take place. So it's probably a little farther than 1971. It's probably like 1922.
Chair, may I make a comment?
Go ahead.
I want to remind us that the people who shop downtown do not live downtown.
Right.
If you look at demographics of our shoppers, the people that support not necessarily the bars and the restaurants, but the downtown shopping, the boutiques, they aren't necessarily from Cedar Falls, Iowa. In fact, many of them are not. So we can talk about walkability and riding our bikes and all of that sort of thing, but to keep the integrity and the vibrancy of our retail, we need to consider parking, because my little old grandma from Parkersburg is not going to ride her bike downtown and go shopping. Neither is the 40-year-old female from Waverly or the 10 ladies who come from Cedar Rapids every summer and spend a couple days here and go shopping and eat and drink. We have to be mindful of that. This is not just a Cedar Falls residents issue. Retail, to stay vibrant, has to draw people in from the region. So we need to be mindful of that. Thank you.
Good comment, Leanne.
Thank you.
Main Street and the C3 districts are successful because they're dense. And I think that we should be providing zoning that encourages density rather than two spaces per bed. In those districts, we just don't have many of those districts in our city.
Right.
And the places that are special, I think,
That's right. Yep.
are that way for a reason.
Yep. It's a special place, absolutely. Very unique. I'm assuming with this zoning rewrite, we've got some kind of benchmarking we're going to do. I guess if you threw a dart at a map and said this is a city that you would want to pattern development after, there's got to be something that is as good a town as Cedar Falls is, that we can see how they structure and run the ordinances in this regard. I don't know, David, whether we've done that, and maybe Stephanie, you've done that, right?
Well, I guess the reason that we have a sum of money budgeted is because we do intend to hire a consultant. So we would go through a selection process for consultants experienced in rewriting codes, and they would be able to bring some examples from other communities, talk about their work, other places, and then we as staff and as the commission and the community, and usually you have some kind of task force that kind of helps write that code, would say, given that information, what do we think is appropriate for our community?
Okay, good.
So David, is there additional direction you need from us, or?
Just a couple more slides here. Again, Stephanie alluded to some developing those definitions for efficiency in studio units, and just kind of doing a survey of you know, internet and what we've built already. You know, if residential units less than 600 square foot would be a start on that limit for those sizes, and that's what we've been kind of constructing here in the past in those projects, and then adopt that new parking ratio of 1 stall per unit, and that would be applied citywide, not just in those districts.
Right.
So what our recommendations is really focus on that first floor, is make sure that majority use is commercial, and if there's parking required, offset that on the upper floor on the second or higher level to keep that commercial percentage high, and keep the residential units on the upper floor, and look at the parking regulations for the residential side of that development. Again, keeping all the parking behind the storefronts, and then work with that efficiency in studio units. So again, using those adjacent properties, assemble some properties, they can still use that for parking. It doesn't need to be building area, so to speak, and then really hammer down that commercial on the first floor is the use of the property. So kind of clear that argument up too. So that's kind of our recommendations, and if we want to kind of develop that, we can bring that back here in the next few meetings.
So you're recommending that if the main floor commercial is actually commercial use, it will be labeled a commercial project?
Yes.
But then you're also recommending that if there's residential above, that it would also have parking
Yes.
requirements.
So this project we just approved would not be approved under that.
Yep.
I still feel fearful of having to park everything,
Well,
no matter what project it is, whether it's...
commercial, I mean, you're not parking any commercial. If you're only parking residential, that's not in my mind, that's not a huge burden, because those are the cars that are likely to just be sitting there clogging up space versus...
There's going to be fees paid to park.
Right.
You know, that's not going to be free.
Right.
If you're an apartment owner, you're going to a good way to get some money.
And we can do, you know, I've started some surveys on other cities, and just take Iowa City, for example. They depend on parking garages and parking ramps for those properties. And their ratios are a lot less. So if you're looking at a 2-bedroom unit, their parking is 1 stall per unit, or maybe a stall and a half. So we can kind of take a look at that, but again, they got massive parking structures down there that offset that on-street parking.
You use that big old parking structure that you and I built, but they're not sharing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the fact. No overnight parking there, you know.
That's right.
Are we doing anything to talk to them?
With you and I?
I doubt we could force their hand to do anything.
I think some of those structures that, I know for a fact the one that was built on 23rd Street was used with federal transit funds. So they kind of tied the bus system in there, and there are requirements to say, hey, that's parking for this type of use. So.
Any other guidance for David to commence
We can-
drafting?
We'll start drafting and present that here in the future sometime.
I think I can speak for everybody that this is much needed. We appreciate staff's, thank you in advance for working on starting these discussions.
Maybe open it up to the public for comments on this too.
We've
If there are
started
any.
discussion on these ordinances. If there's some individuals here that would like to make some comments, please feel free to come up to the microphone.
Other than that,
Rickard, 223 West 2nd, again. Okay. No, I don't have anything prepared. I would encourage you to look real hard at the residential areas in the C3, okay? Require the parking that's in R4, the 2-for-1. We need the parking for commercial use downtown, not for residential parking. If this standard had been applied to the building that's going up next to me, they would have had to put in about 130 some parking spaces. Right now it's in the 60 some range, roughly about 70 parking spaces short from what is required in an R4 anyplace else. Parking, that means they're essentially 70 parking places short. Those are going to come from the street. Street parking is marked out here. Essentially, what they're short would take up every space from First Street, Washington, Franklin, down to just past 3rd Street, which means all these city employees and things are going to be parked on the other side of the Women's Club. Parking is a big issue down here because
again, like Leanne said, commercial parking is really needed, not the residential parking on the street. Thank you.
Yes. I'm not going to talk a lot about any specifics, but we did just go through, I just wanted to offer a few things that are coming up. We just
State your name.
Sure. Dan Drendel, Slingshot Architecture, 305 East Court, Des Moines. We just went through, or we are about to approve a new zoning ordinance in Des Moines. And some of the sequences that really made that a powerful experience was, first off, the ULI and the city kind of teamed up to make several events, or really probably a year's worth of kind of learning and events that were community events, talking about walkability, talking about what we wanted to achieve. That led into a master plan that was done called Plan Des Moines. And then, so essentially, the vision of what we wanted to achieve was laid out before we tried to codify it in zoning. And if that's at all possible, I would highly recommend it. It was, instead of thinking about what do we need to control, we could think about just where we wanted to go, and then we could talk about how to do that together. And when we were working on the zoning, we brought in people from all different situations, public, but also professionals, just to get feedback about, if this zoning was put in place in this way, what would that affect, and try to get that. So that was really good. I think just the biggest powerful thing was to have the vision first and not just try to codify reactionary. Because that's kind of like what I'm hearing from you guys is that's what you kind of wish you had or what you want to do, right? You want to look to the future. You don't want to base it on 1971. The point, I think 200 West First is a great project to look at for your density conversation and where parking is at, because it did park for the current residential requirements, and we were only 3 stories tall. We parked under half the building, and we still took up almost half the block with parking and building frontage. And we only got not even a quarter block of commercial. So the main thing I point to that project for you guys to realize is that's the density that can kind of be achieved by the market right now based on the parking requirements. So if we want to go denser, if we want to have more storefronts on a block, which I totally agree, I think Marty was making exactly the right points about that, about storefront and about active street fronts and about active sidewalks. To do that, we're going to have to get denser than 200 West First if it's going to be any taller and kind of pay for itself. And we're feeling pressure on the parking. So to get any better than that or to have a more walkable block, you're talking about structured parking type solutions or shared parking. And what can be great about that is that then it's not one for one on that block, right? The actual experience over at River Place is that they're not using all their parking because people are in and out, and so it's not all being used, which is another great learning point for what we're doing out here. So if we can figure out a way where we're actually sharing densified parking for the C3 neighborhood, then we can start to get to some of these storefronts and really dense blocks like what Main Street is like. It's going to be really hard to build mixed use and park on those sites. We're just going to get lots of blocks like 200 West First. And I think keep pointing to it because that's the market pressures and the zoning ordinance and everything. 200 West First is exactly what the current zoning will generate plus market rate. And it's fine. I think we did the best that we could, and I think that height is nice, but if you fill out the whole middle section of the city that way, it's going to be half vacant blocks. One other really small one, when you guys were talking about transparency, and particularly the ground floor transparency, the other thing that we're looking at in Des Moines is how many doors we're getting, because you can have a fully glassed up building and it can still not feel very active if there's not very many places to enter. So we make sure that residential entries get put on public streets if it's a mixed-use building. So we have a lobby and that kind of component there. And then we try to make sure and it's kind of just subjective, but that there's doors every so often, even if it's one big commercial tenant, just so that it has access points. And sorry, one more thought that we kind of learned. The way that Des Moines zoning ordinance is put in, essentially all the things are going to be very objective, like you guys were saying, should things be objective or subjective? There's very objective standards. If you just meet those, you can get through with basically an approval or a staff approval. If you want to come and propose something else that's more subjective, that can also be proposed. It's just a longer process. So just another learning point that we implemented there, so that there's still the opportunity for creativity, but if you want to go in and just get in fast and follow all the rules, it would still yield a good building with lots of transparency, very active ground floors, and so anyway. I'll hang out and talk about density and parking garages if anybody wants to talk.
Thank you.
Jeanette Geisler. I realize now I wish I would have spoke earlier in this meeting and the one before, but I guess what I just want to say is I agree on different issues. Yes, we do want more density, but if you go down to Des Moines, I went down there during the state wrestling, I had a son that made it to state wrestling, and guess what? Parking ramps going up all over the place. Busiest time in state wrestling, I come late and I can still find a spot. We don't have that in this city. So I own 5 buildings, 1 block behind, the OP and Beck's right there. I own 5 right in a row. And I have 106 spots, 1 for every one of my people, plus another 20-plus parking visitor spots. I could tow every day. I could go in and tow 20 cars daily if I wanted to. And what I'm towing is I'm towing all the gentlemen that were here. I am towing their workers. I mean, they're coming to me, we have nowhere to park. I said, I'm sorry, these are for my tenants. I'm towing Kyle's workers. I'm towing all these are the workers. These aren't the occupants coming to accompany their business. So yes, we have a huge parking problem. I've been up here since 1990. I lived 2 blocks from the hill in 1990 on the corner of 26th and Olive. And after that, my husband and I moved 1 house over and then 2 houses over. For 10 years, we lived within 2 blocks of the campus. And after that, we started developing. Never once have I not had parking problems. So, I mean, you can talk to whatever residents you want. You don't have to believe us, but there is a parking problem, Brian. I've lived there and I've developed there and I live it daily. I'm called daily. L&M Transmission is going to make a lot of money after this complex goes up because I own a complex to the east of this and I own 3 houses. When you looked at that picture and you saw that house to the left, I am the C3, 3 down from that. And I have a 7-plex and that's completely full. Now, where are these? He's got 196 spots he's supposed to have for this. He's got 65. That's 131 short. Where will they park? I would never in my mind put up something like this without parking. It's not fair to the tenants, and it's not fair to the city, and it's not fair to the people that live there, period. And if you look at the College Hill Partnership, how it's written, it's identical to the downtown. I'd called Shane on this. Because Shane had told me at a College Hill Partnership meeting, the downtown specifically says it has to have parking for the occupants. You just heard David Search say that's not true. They both reference 29-177, where it talks about upper accessory units do not have to off-street parking. But it tells you guys and City Council that you have to look at that unit and determine if it really truly is incidental. And it is this accessory, and it's not incidental accessory. This is a huge residential complex, Marty, thank you. And it needs the parking. Thanks.
Talking about that planning thing, it's been a few years now. We had RDG, the city, and did that whole study.
The comprehensive plan.
Comprehensive plan, which was designed to kind of be the lead-in to the new zoning ordinance. And there was a lot of good stuff that came out of that, and that'd be something that there's a lot of new commission members that probably aren't aware of that happened a few years ago. They had a lot of good ideas that they brought forth, I thought, in that. And they looked at, that's the entire city they were looking at, not just C3, which is the hot topic of today, but.
Well, and that does the planning work that Mr. Reynolds was referencing being done that helps drive the.
Right, drives that discussion.
Code changes.
Yep.
City staff, any discussion of late about comprehensive planning work to be done, zoning work?
I I think that was a good point, that actually the revisions to the zoning ordinance were a recommendation out of the 2012 comprehensive plan, and took a bit to budget for those. And then, like I said, we've had some other things going on. So I was jotting down here that we should revisit that in terms of maybe educating the commission, doing a couple educational types of workshops on some of the elements that were found in that comprehensive plan, and see how we feel about that being a precursor to leading into the zoning ordinance. We do have in our capital improvements plan a couple further years out to start budgeting for an update to our comprehensive plan. That's certainly something that we can talk about in terms of timing. We have done some work internally taking a look at what have we implemented from the comprehensive plan. We'd like to be in front of you presenting that with a little bit of a progress update about how far are we, and is it time to do some updates to that plan. So I think we'll be talking about this a lot more in the coming year.
We need to pull it off the shelf,
Yes.
dust it off, see where we're at on that.
I've got a question on metered parking versus non-metered in city lots. What's the basis of why something's metered and why something's not? Because as I talked about it at my own personal survey, which is, some people could say biased, whatever, it's the facts that I took down. That lot behind Social House, behind the street between 22nd and 23rd Street is almost always empty. You can drive by it at any time of the day, and that lot is almost always empty. It's the only metered lot there. That's a fact. And it's almost always empty. And so I'm curious to know what a metered lot behind Sidecar and Mohair Pear and those businesses would do for parking for these patrons that come from out of the area. That Leanne and Jeanette and business owners on the Hill may be concerned about. That lot is almost always empty. You can drive by it any time of the day. And so metered parking obviously has an effect on how people park. And Nick mentioned it, and I agreed with that completely. When he came up, Mr. Tyber came up and talked about metered versus having free parking in town. People will take the path of least resistance and park where they don't have to pay. And so if they have metered parking lots behind these businesses, I think there will always be a place for them to park. And is that something that you guys can change? That was my real question.
I wasn't sure if that was a question or statement or where that was going, so I apologize that I walked away on you.
Filibuster, yeah.
Well, in terms of the history of maybe why a lot is metered versus not, I would have to look into that to be able to inform on that. I believe there are probably many of you at the table that know that in the downtown, for example, parking, there used to be meters. Now some of the lots have permits, that time of and so it kind of reflects the trends and the interest of the community at the time. And it may be that this is an area that needs to be revisited about whether there should be some kind of paid parking system that's comprehensive throughout an area versus specific to a lot or that type of thing, that it should include maybe the on-street and off-street parking opportunities, maybe even be a tiered system to be more expensive where it's more convenient and less expensive and maybe even free the further you go out. There, as you go to other communities, you can see a lot of different examples of how people do that. I have experience in a former community of where we just charged 25 cents an hour. So the point was really to get the turnover and have some enforceability to it. And then it did create some revenue to be able to reinvest in parking lots and maybe create other parking lots. That's a very expensive endeavor to provide parking.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Perhaps if we want density, we should get the developers to pay toward some of those shared amenities, as you're describing. I mean, there's ways to do that.
Yes.
Good comments. I think obviously we've had two initial discussions of different zoning work and a lot of discussion to continue. David, any time estimation of when we want to address again the principal accessory.
Oh, it probably won't come to, want to do some more research, and then might be looking at later in February, into March timeframe.
Thank you. Any other comments, final discussion from commission? Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
There's a motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor, signify with aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay? Thank you. We are adjourned.